In the winter of 1405, the largest wooden ships ever built slipped out of the harbour at Nanjing, and the empire that built them would spend the next century trying to erase the fact that they ever existed. 62 of them led the way, each longer than a football field, each taller than a 4-story house. Around them sailed hundreds more, carrying nearly 30,000 men. Christopher Columbus would not be born for another 46 years, and when he finally crossed the Atlantic, his flagship would be smaller than a single lifeboat on the vessel at the head of this fleet. This was the greatest navy the world had ever seen. And within 3 generations, China would burn its own records, outlaw its own ships, and let the harbour that launched them silt into mud. This is the story of how a superpower chose to disappear. The man who commanded it was the unlikeliest admiral in history. His name was Zheng He, and he was born a Muslim in the mountains of Yunnan in China's far southwest. As a boy, he was captured during a Ming military campaign, castrated, and sent into the imperial palace as a eunuch servant, the lowest rung of the court. But he was brilliant, and he was loyal, and he attached himself to a prince named Zhu Di. When Zhu Di seized the throne from his own nephew in a bloody civil war and crowned himself the Yongle emperor, he rewarded the eunuch who had fought beside him with the most extraordinary command ever given: take the prestige of China to the ends of the known world. The vessels Zheng He commanded were called Baokuan, treasure ships, and the name was deliberate. The Ming Shilu, the official court chronicle, records the largest of them at roughly 440 feet from bow to stern. Modern scholars argue about that number. Some think it physically impossible for a wooden hull and place the real figure closer to 250 feet. But even the conservative estimate describes a ship more than 4 times the length of Columbus's Santa Maria. These were floating cities. They carried translators who spoke Arabic, Malay, and Tamil. They carried doctors, astrologers, soldiers, and merchants. They carried fresh water in tanks and enough silk and porcelain to buy the loyalty of kings. And buying loyalty was the point. The Yongle Emperor did not send the fleet to conquer. He sent it to collect tribute, to arrive in a foreign harbour with overwhelming force and leave having made the local ruler a friend of China rather than a target of it. Over 7 voyages, the treasure fleet reached Java, Sumatra, Ceylon, the great Indian port of Calicut, the Persian Gulf, and finally the coast of East Africa. From Malindi in what is now Kenya, the fleet brought back a creature no one at the Chinese court had ever seen, a living giraffe. It was presented to the emperor as a qilin, a mythical beast whose appearance was said to signal a wise and virtuous ruler. The fleet was not only projecting power abroad, it was manufacturing the emperor's legitimacy at home. These expeditions were not without teeth, though. On the 3rd voyage in 1411, Zheng He intervened in a dynastic war in Ceylon, defeated a hostile king, and carried him back to Nanjing as a captive. The message to every port from the South China Sea to the Swahili coast was clear. China's friendship was generous, and China's displeasure arrived in a fleet you could not possibly fight. But here is what most tellings of this story leave out. From the very beginning, the voyages were politically poisonous inside China itself, and the people who hated them most were the ones who would ultimately win. The Ming state was run by Confucian scholar officials, men who had passed brutal examinations in classical philosophy and believed that they, and only they, should hold real power. To them, everything about the treasure fleet was an insult. It was run by eunuchs, their hated rivals for the emperor's ear. It celebrated trade and the outside world, which they held beneath the dignity of a civilized state. And it was monstrously expensive. Every voyage that sailed was a victory for the eunuch faction and a humiliation for the scholars. And the scholars were patient. When the Yongle Emperor died in 1424, his successor cancelled the voyages within months. They flickered back to life one last time under the next emperor, and in 1431 the aging Zheng He led the seventh and final expedition out to sea. He is believed to have died on the return leg, somewhere in the Indian Ocean, in 1433. With him died the last man powerful enough to protect the fleet, and then the scholars did something that goes far beyond cancelling a program. They set out to erase it. Evidence strongly suggests the official records of the voyages, the charts, the logs, the accounts of everywhere the fleet had been, were deliberately destroyed. The story passed down is that a court official named Liu Daxia seized the documents and had them burned, calling them a deceitful record of expeditions that had cost thousands of lives and a fortune in treasure. Some historians argue the papers were hidden rather than burned. Either way, they vanished from history. Then it became illegal to build a seagoing ship with more than 2 masts. The great dry docks of Nanjing fell silent and silted up. The shipwrights scattered. Within a single generation, China had not merely stopped sailing, it had dismantled the very knowledge of how the greatest fleet in the world had been built, until it was almost as if none of it had ever happened. Now hold the timeline in your mind. The treasure fleet was abandoned after 1433. 64 years later, in 1497, a Portuguese captain named Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope with 4 small ships and entered the Indian Ocean. The same ocean China had utterly dominated within living memory and then simply walked away from. The harbours that had once welcomed Zheng He's floating cities found Europeans arriving instead, and this time the visitors came not to collect tribute but to seize ports, build forts and stay. The deep water knowledge, the trade relationships, the maps, all of it had been burned or buried. China had held the greatest lead in the world and chose deliberately to let it go. And the men who burned the records very nearly finished the job. For 500 years afterward, the largest fleet that ever sailed was remembered as little more than a fable. Giant ships that surely could never have been real. They didn't just end the voyages, they almost succeeded in erasing them from history altogether. And we are only now piecing back together how close they came. There always seems to be. More than we were told, subscribe and keep exploring the mind of Matt.